For over 4 years, Putin and his many cronies have thought that they will be able to get away with invading Ukraine. Even if the invasion doesn't result in Ukraine's collapse, those Kremlin creatures can avoid being prosecuted. But everything has just changed. Over 30 countries have combined to build a personal prison for Putin and his lackeys. Justice is coming. The groundwork has been laid as dozens of nations are preparing to drag Putin and his pals before a Hague-like tribunal. The news broke on May 15th. A special tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine has been created. That tribunal essentially means that a specially made court is ready and waiting to convict Putin and as many of his supporters as possible for a crime that is outside of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, or ICC. And if Putin thinks this is a small matter, he's wrong. Dozens of countries, most of them in Europe, have joined together to make sure that this tribunal represents a threat against Putin for as long as he rules Russia. All told, 36 countries have signed on the dotted line to show their support for the tribunal, and they have all agreed that it will be headquartered in a city with a long history of dealing with the law. The Hague in the Netherlands will be the site where Putin and his accomplices are tried. That means the internationally recognized city of peace and justice is where Putin's entire empire may come crumbling down. One of many who is very happy about all of this is Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha. He was present as the new tribunal was made official, and he took to X to explain why this is such a huge moment for Ukraine. Today is a historic day. We are making history. Just like the Nuremberg Tribunal 80 years ago, this special tribunal in The Hague will restore justice from the ruins of war, Sybiha declared. He called the formation of this new entity the point of no return for Putin, as the special tribunal has become a legal reality. Sybiha also provided some insight into what the tribunal will cover, as he stated, "We are creating an infrastructure of accountability with 3 pillars: the special tribunal, the register of damages, and the claims commission." We'll have more on the structure in a moment, but before that, there are a lot of countries involved in this tribunal. The full list of nations that have endorsed the tribunal reads like a who's who of Putin's European enemies. The heaviest hitters are France, Germany, the UK, and the nation that will host the tribunal, the Netherlands. But there are so many more, large and small. Andorra, Austria, Belgium, Croatia, and Cyprus are all signatories. So too are Denmark, Finland, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the Czech Republic. Adding more names to the list are Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Moldova, Montenegro, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. Even relative minnows such as San Marino and Monaco have used the opportunity to register their disgust of Putin's actions and confirm that they will do all they can to bring the Russian leader to justice. Plus, there are signatories outside of Europe such as Costa Rica and Australia that have lent their voices to the special tribunal. And back in Europe, the European Union has endorsed the tribunal, despite the fact that member states including Bulgaria, Malta, Slovakia, and Hungary haven't signed up. And of course, there is Ukraine. Observant viewers will note that there is one major name missing from the list, the US. America hasn't signed up to the special tribunal as it seems more determined to pursue a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine that would settle the war without bringing Putin and his cronies to trial. However, the list remains open for any country to join. A wide net has already been cast for Putin and his pals. That net could grow even wider as more nations sign on the dotted line, and it could become inescapable if the US decides to lend its weight to the tribunal. So the documentation has been signed. The special tribunal is official. But what does the structure of all of this actually look like? Sybiha gave us some clues when mentioning the 3 pillars that the tribunal will pursue. Euronews adds to this by noting that Alain Berset, who is the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, has called on all participants to begin work on their individual legislative procedures and to each start allocating the funding required to allow the tribunal to get to work as soon as possible. This tells us that each signatory will have its own legal framework in place, though we'll likely see plenty of crossover, and that all 36 have skin in the game in the form of money they'll be using to set up the structures. The EU has gotten a jump on everybody else by committing 10 million euros, or about $11.6 million, to getting itself set up. More money will follow. If all other nations follow suit, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be invested, and extensive legal frameworks will be created to bring Putin to justice. On top of all of this, a committee has already been created that will oversee the annual budget dedicated to the work the tribunal does. That committee will also oversee the mechanics of the tribunal, including the election of judges and prosecutors when the time comes for trials and the adoption of internal rules that dictate how those trials will be held. All signatories have agreed to respect the tribunal's independence, which should go a long way to ensuring that it doesn't get wrapped up in red tape caused by infighting. What we're seeing here is a unified response to the plague of Putin. As we all know, unity within Europe is always the last thing that Putin wants to see. A legal reality has just slapped Putin round the face. But questions still remain, particularly in terms of what this all means for Russia, and whether Putin and his cronies will ever find themselves standing in front of a judge to take accountability for the crimes that they have committed. We'll come back to that second question. In terms of what all of this means, the Special Tribunal is something that Ukraine has been pushing Europe to form for several years. As far back as December 2022, the Atlantic Council reported on comments made by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky about the formation of a special tribunal that will be able to prosecute Putin for crimes that are outside the jurisdiction of the ICC and other existing criminal courts. Those December calls were a reiteration of Zelensky's push for a tribunal that had begun almost from the moment that Russia launched its invasion. "The crime of aggression is the alpha and omega of the war," Zelensky said at the time, adding, "To start a criminal and unprovoked war is to open the door to thousands of crimes committed during hostilities and in occupied territory." Those calls took a while to answer, but the foundation of what we have just seen become official was being laid several years prior. In May 2025, many of Ukraine's allies that have now put pen to paper endorsed the creation of the tribunal, which they plan to be capable of delivering a host of sentences up to and including life imprisonment for anybody who came before it and was convicted. The US was a major absence in that endorsement, though it had been a key part of helping to form the special tribunal during former President Joe Biden's tenure. Current President Donald Trump was in charge by the time the endorsement was made, and he seemed more focused on mediating peace talks than on prosecuting Putin. Nothing seems to have changed in that regard. So what all of this means is that the tribunal being made official amounts to the realization of something that Ukraine has wanted since the beginning of Putin's invasion. This is a legal mechanism that didn't exist before, and it's been created with the sole purpose of punishing Putin and his fellow war criminals. But what many may not realize is that the entire reason why this tribunal has to exist at all is that there is a very specific crime for which Putin can't be convicted by existing courts. Before we reveal what that crime is, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. There's a lot more where this comes from, so hit subscribe to keep up with the channel. Normally, the types of crimes that the new special tribunal has been created to prosecute will be handled by the ICC, and one crime in particular is the one that Ukraine wants to get Putin and as many of his allies as possible in the dock for, the crime of aggression. There's practically no denying that Putin and his generals are guilty of this crime. The Coalition for the ICC describes this particular crime as follows. The act of aggression means the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. Anybody who is prosecuted for this particular crime by the ICC must be a political or military leader, which covers Putin, his Kremlin cronies, his generals, and even some of the leaders of other countries that have assisted Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. And for a conviction to be achieved, the courts must prove that the defendant was involved in one or more of the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of a state act of aggression against another nation. So Putin is banged to rights. He would have literally no defense against any of these charges. But there's a problem, and this problem is the reason why the special tribunal had to be created in the first place. For the ICC to convict any leader of the crime of aggression, that crime must be attributed to a state party that is a signatory to the Rome Statute. Russia isn't a signatory. In fact, it can even use its veto as a member of the United Nations Security Council to block a referral from the Security Council that could otherwise give the ICC a route to prosecute Putin and his lackeys for the crime of aggression. The architects of the Ukraine invasion can't be held to account by the ICC for something that even the judges at Nuremberg called the supreme international crime when they were dealing with the Nazis in the aftermath of World War II. This isn't to say the ICC is useless when it comes to convicting Putin for his crimes. Russia's leader has many others, as DW points out, and there are ICC warrants out for Putin and his cronies for more specific crimes, including unlawful deportation and transfer of children, and deliberately targeting civilians with Russia's attacks. But the ICC can't get Putin for the crime of aggression. The new special tribunal can. It exists to prosecute the crimes that the ICC has deemed to be outside of its jurisdiction. But that brings us back to our earlier question, which is whether the special tribunal will actually be effective in bringing Putin and his cronies to justice. And that question isn't easy to answer. DW notes that most of the signatories for the new tribunal are members of the Council of Europe. Russia used to be a member of that council, though it was booted out when Putin invaded Ukraine. But that doesn't appear to be a factor in whether the council can take part in trials designed to prosecute Putin. So that's one barrier out of the way. The far larger barrier lies in how the tribunal would attempt to target Putin. Euronews reports that the crime of aggression is considered to be a leadership crime that falls on the shoulders of the people who made the decisions to commit an act of aggression, such as the invasion of another country. Typically, the ICC, as well as the new tribunal, would prosecute the Troika in Russia, which is a group that includes the country's president, prime minister, and foreign minister. Others can and will be prosecuted, including high-ranking military commanders who have helped to organize and oversee the assault on Ukraine's sovereignty. But it's the Troika issue that is the major problem for the tribunal. That Troika is immune to being tried in absentia, which means that the only way for Putin to be prosecuted, even though the tribunal gets around the ICC jurisdiction problem, is for him to be physically detained and brought to trial. That could happen if Putin is ever dumb enough to travel through one of the special tribunal's signatory nations, though that seems an unlikely move for Russia's president. So the personal prison built for Putin will have to wait. But that isn't the case for the prisons being built for the many cronies who have helped him execute his Ukraine invasion. Those outside of the Troika can be prosecuted in absentia. Euronews brings up the example of Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. He's a valuable ally for Putin, as well as a man who is willing to lie to Russia's leaders about his army's gains in Ukraine so that Putin can pretend that his invasion is going well, as he did in September 2025, when he exaggerated Russian gains in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. Euronews also suggests that top-ranking officials from countries like Belarus and North Korea could face similar trials in absentia for the roles that they've played, though it seems that the presidents of those nations have the same advantages as the Russian Troika. Those who are found guilty could be sentenced to prison, with life sentences on the table for the most notable offenses. Fines and the confiscation of personal property can also be used as punishment, with the money generated by this likely to be funneled into a compensation fund for the victims of Russia's crime of aggression. However, even these in absentia convictions can only be carried out if the subject of the trial is foolish enough to place themselves into the hands of the special tribunal. And if those subjects do decide to appear in person, they can appeal their original sentences in front of the courts. If all of this is the case, the obvious question has to be asked: what's the point of the special tribunal? There are several points. Let's start with those punishments. While it's true that Putin and his cronies won't see the inside of a prison cell unless the tribunal gets its hands on them, the financial penalties can be a problem. Sure, they're not going to pay fines directly, but those convicted can have property confiscated. That will likely include assets they have in any of the tribunal's signatory nations, meaning it's possible that frozen funds belonging to individuals outside of the Troika could be seized and given to Ukraine. If the convicted want to get those assets back, they'll have to stand trial and prove their innocence. There's also what this tribunal represents in terms of closing a gap in the ICC jurisdiction that made it impossible to prosecute anybody in Russia for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Global Rights Compliance points out that the Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals are the only two entities to have successfully prosecuted this crime since it was codified in the 1940s. Many other entities have been created since that cover war crimes, but none of them have had universal jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. The new special jurisdiction doesn't either, but it fills the gaps in jurisdictional limits that makes Putin and his cronies vulnerable to facing punishment for their crimes. The impact of that cannot be understated. What this means is that the movements of all individuals the new tribunal could target have been severely limited. A Russian general or politician who was involved in the Ukraine war can no longer travel to Germany or France. They can't squirrel away assets in any nation that is a signatory to the tribunal. And if more names are added to the list, as is possible, given that the list is open to new signatories, Russia's war criminals will end up increasingly isolated on their own turf. Add all of this to the message that the tribunal sends to Putin. It was only back in December that Putin attempted to extend an olive branch to Europe. He declared that Russia would wage no more wars on the continent as long as the West treated Russia with respect. Putin also dismissed the claims that he was planning to attack other European nations other than Ukraine as nonsense. This was a transparent attempt to curry favor. Putin was basically saying, "Stop supporting Ukraine and I pinky swear that Russia won't invade your countries." It was another attempt to create division in Europe, to manipulate the narrative as Putin sees it. The 36 signatories to the special tribunal, the vast majority of which are westernized European nations, are a clear rejection of what Putin attempted to offer. He and his many cronies are war criminals, Europe is saying. Not only that, but they're guilty of a crime that is on par with the one that the worst of the Nazi regime were tried and convicted for. If Putin ever wondered if he had a way back into the good graces of Europe and the West, the creation of this tribunal tells him that he doesn't. And finally, the Kyiv Independent makes an interesting point about this tribunal. It's not just about Russia, it's about validation for Ukraine. The fact that the tribunal exists at all is yet another sign that most of Europe, along with several other nations outside the continent, stand with Ukraine in condemning Putin and his cronies for what they've done. The special tribunal can also give a voice to the voiceless and, if it's able to execute on its ambitions, will be able to deliver compensation to those who've been affected by the worst of what Putin has wrought in Ukraine. Apprehending criminals is not the only thing that such tribunals can do. The Kyiv Independent brings up the example of legal action worldwide, or law, which has represented the survivors of the Rohingya community in Myanmar, who were stripped of their citizenship in 1982 and subjected to immense violence. Law's work has enabled the survivors and witnesses of that atrocity to reach the International Court of Justice with their story. A full merits hearing was held in that court in January 2026, and the first-hand testimonies delivered could serve as a blueprint for more voices to be heard during criminal proceedings related to other atrocities, such as the invasion of Ukraine. For Russia, all of this means that dozens of countries are coming for Putin and his accomplices personally. The prison cells are waiting. Only time will tell how effective the new special tribunal is at filling them. One other name that may be on the list for potential prosecution is the dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. And Lukashenko is on the verge of making this an easy case for the tribunal. He has gone insane as he prepares for a war that he should have no part in. Find out more about what Belarus is doing and what it could mean for Ukraine in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our analysis of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you as always for watching.